You're listening to the Valley Current.
Hey, Jim, how have you been?
Pretty good. How are you doing? That doesn't look like Japan behind you.
No, I am in Japan, but I've got this virtual background. Of course, it's the Bay Area, and it's so beautiful.
That's true, especially with the aurora borealis happening.
I have to say, we live in a world that is so amazing because years ago, you would never know instantly that stuff like that was happening all over the world. But today, you know almost everything instantly.
That is true.
And I think your book, and I was just amazed, I actually listened to it twice because I love hearing your voice. The audible version. The audible version came out just a couple of days ago, as you know, and you do a masterful job in presenting the material with the correct emphasis, because there's really a great story within a story within a story of how you were changed by a woman who was in a magic shop, because I also, of course, read and listened to your first book as well, and we did a podcast about that. And I said to myself, you know, Jim and I have had so many parallel lives because I've met people in my life that have had amazing consequences to the direction in which life took. And I never realized it until I read your first book, which was a while ago when it first came out. And then I'm realizing more and more that many things were embedded from that change, because I had a near-death experience in a car accident. I was in the hospital for 6 weeks in New York. You don't know that story, very few people do. But that event and the people that I met in that hospital, medical doctors, very much like you, very caring people, really changed the direction of where I took my life. And in general, I think many things got implanted in my brain from that moment forward, in the way in which I sort of then realized that I was on this earth to serve others in a variety of ways that I do now, in expanding their human potential. And I think you really had the same thing happen to you. So why don't you just tell us a little more about that, because now you've probed deeper into what were the brain mechanisms that caused that to occur in your new book that's called Mind Magic, which I think everyone should get, like for every student on the globe, literally.
Well, yeah, that's very kind of you. Well, obviously, you know my backstory, and I grew up in poverty. My mother was an alcoholic. I should say, my father was an alcoholic. It's too early in the morning.
My father was. You're good at 6 a.m. I like that about you, because I'm in Japan where it's 10 p.m.
Yeah. You know, it's funny because I had to do a conference call, and one person was in Europe, another in Asia, and another here. So you can imagine how complicated and trying to find the right time. And of course, one of those people, it was quite early, much earlier than 6 a.m. To be on that call. But getting back to the story, I grew up in poverty. My father was an alcoholic. My mother had a stroke when I was a child. And as a result, she was partially paralyzed, had a seizure disorder, and was chronically depressed, and unfortunately attempted suicide multiple times. As a result, obviously, this was a very chaotic childhood, and I'm sure you or any of your listeners are familiar with the word ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, and how situations like poverty, abuse, neglect, alcohol or drug abuse, mental illness, all have a very negative impact on one's ability to succeed in life. Now, of course, we have to define what success is, but by traditional standards in the West, of course, it's money, power, position. And interestingly, at the age of 12, I would get on my bicycle and ride as far as and as fast away as possible when there was significant conflict at my house. And one day I did that and ended up at a strip mall where there was a magic shop. And I'd had a long time interest in magic. So I went in, but the owner was not there. His mother was there. And I'm sure you have met, as well as many of your listeners, have met people who have a radiance about them, embracing smile, a kindness. And as a child, she did not look down on me, especially since I was, if you will, very poor. And you could probably tell by my dress. But she looked at me as an equal and asked me questions. And she created what I would call an environment of psychological safety, which is what all of us want. We want somebody to listen, treat us like an equal, not look down upon us. And that's the way her and I interacted. And ultimately, she asked me several probing questions, which I answered honestly, and normally I would not. But to cut to the chase here, ultimately she said to me, I really like you. I'm here for another 6 weeks. And if you show up, I think I could teach you something that could really help you. And I did show up. And over that period of time, and this was before the term mindfulness or meditation or neuroplasticity were ever used. But over that period of time, she taught me a mindfulness practice or a mind training practice, which had the fundamental result of me being able to relax, because children who grow up in these traumatic environments have a form of trauma. And it's very similar to what affects a war veteran who's been exposed to the trauma of war. And your muscles are always tense. You never know what's going to happen. And so she taught me a way to relax my body, to attend. And what I mean by that is if you're always waiting for the unexpected, you can't be present to learn anything. So she taught me a practice of focusing, and then an understanding that the negative dialogue in my head was not truth. It was a dialogue that I had created. And through this type of interaction with her, I was able to exchange or limit that negative dialogue by giving myself positive self-affirmation. And what happens for so many people is that we are very hypercritical with ourselves, and that actually affects how we look at the world. So this changed how I looked at the world. And what I tell people is when I changed how I looked at the world changed how it looked at me. And finally, she taught me a visualization or manifestation practice. Now, I have to tell you, at the age of 12 and being poor, my belief of what I needed to be successful or accepted fell into what the Western standard of success is. I was going to be a successful doctor. I was going to be a millionaire. I was going to have a mansion. I like sports cars. I wanted a Porsche. I wanted a Rolex watch, all these external signs of quote unquote success. And I did use these practices. The problem was, though, that there was a difference between what I wanted and what I needed. And I did get everything I wanted. The problem was that the reason I wanted that was for external affirmation to tell me that I was okay, to get rid of the shame and insecurity that I had. And the reality, though, was that at the peak of every mountain I climbed, while I would get external affirmation, it didn't make me feel any better whatsoever. And ultimately, everything crashed down. And of course, this is well documented in my first book, Into the Magic Shop. And during the dot-com crisis, here I had been a very successful entrepreneur, had invested in different companies. And over a period of 8 weeks.
It was like 6 weeks, because I remember that was a company, by the way, we'll leave its name out, that I started with a couple of founders. So I know the story, and I know how rich I was at the height of that company. So we had that other parallel. We were involved in that company. I was on the board and effectively co-founded that company with two great guys, one of which wrote a book about the story, and who actually is a serial entrepreneur, and I helped him start another company as well. And, both of those gentlemen are very smart Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, and that company did amazingly well at the height of the dot-com bubble. and it went down almost as fast as it went up. And I know at one point, just to give you this footnote, because it brought back all those memories as I re-listened to your story. You know, my previous wife died of pancreatic cancer, but at the very top of that .com thing where our net worth was north of, I don't know, 250 million or some huge mega number. And I didn't buy the island in New Zealand, and I didn't do any of those things. I started a nonprofit. The one good thing I did is I started a nonprofit and moved some stock into the nonprofit and cashed out of it. So the nonprofit actually did quite well and did succeed in selling some of the stock to get more diversity as it had to do. But she said to me, we should just punch out and retire and live in Europe and travel. And I remember looking at her like, I'm going to give this money away and I'm going to do some wonderful things because my life changed years ago. And she just looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, really, it's not about, I said, Carol, it's not really about just consuming. And she really turned to me at one point and she said, you know, you just don't understand what it's like to live the good life in Paris. And she did move to Paris, and we did end up separating, unfortunately. And she did subsequently die of pancreatic cancer. And it's kind of a very sad and pointed story because I think very much of her when I think about your journey in a way that, you know, you eventually learned so much from it because you have started a nonprofit that's doing some amazing things in the area of compassion, which I think everyone should just study. And I think that was the big learning that came out of that for you, right?
Yeah, well, as you know, I mean, I lost all of that money, because unfortunately I had a lock-in agreement. Now, if things had been 3 months later, all would have been good, at least on some level. But as you recall, back in those days, you could borrow against publicly traded stock. I think about 5%. So I had borrowed 15 million. And that enabled me to do all of these different things. But of course, when everything crashed, my two friends came a-calling, and that was the banker asking me how I was going to pay back this loan since I had was minus 3 million by this time. And then my lawyer. Long story short, I did sell pretty much everything. My house in Newport Beach overlooking the bay, my penthouse in San Francisco, my villa in Florence. I canceled the 6,500 acre island purchase in New Zealand and sold all of my cars pretty much. Now, I certainly don't want anybody to feel sorry for me because at the end of the day, I was still a professor of neurosurgery at Stanford and I was not going to starve. But the lesson I did learn from that was that it gave me insight because I went back and reflected on everything. And I realized that, and I certainly, I don't believe it was really my fault, but because of my age, lack of self-awareness, my poverty, I had focused on the wrong thing. And that experience gave me the insight to look at the world in a different way. And don't get me wrong, I was never a bad doctor or mean. It's just I was focused that everything was on me because of my own shame and insecurity. I felt I had to push myself to do all of these things so I would get external affirmation. But during this period of reflection, I realized that that focus on me had actually did not help me. And when I went through this exercise, my lawyer also informed me that what's it called?
A nonprofit.
Yeah, the nonprofit, the trust. They had never actually filed the paperwork, so I could have kept all that stock. But after this period of reflection, I went ahead and gave it all away. And the extraordinary thing was, you could look at it as saying I went from rags to rags again. But the riches I got after that far exceeded the monetary riches I had gotten. And that allowed me to set up the center that studies compassion at Stanford, allowed me to meet the Dalai Lama, who became our founding benefactor, allowed me to meet many of the major spiritual and religious leaders in the world. and really completely changed my perspective because it was no longer about me. It was looking at the world through the lens of compassion, understanding everyone was suffering, and how could I be of service. And that ultimately was the point of the first book, and fundamentally is the point of this most recent book, because what I realized is that the way to get what you truly want, what will help you and change your perspective, as well as actually make you healthier and live longer, is to focus on being of service. And the money I ended up giving away was stock in a company that ultimately went public, and that ended up being $30 million. And I set up blood banks and health clinics around the world, set up a program for adolescents affected by AIDS, HIV, programs for the disabled, scholarships, endowed chairs. And it really put me back on the right track. And it was profound. And I feel very blessed that I was able to do that. And also, writing this most recent book really allowed me to sit down and sort through my thoughts and try to distill out, if you will, not only understanding how your brain works, but also how, if you will, to maximize your ability to train your mind to give you the greatest possibility of success. But as you know, living in Silicon Valley, it's not about the money, which so many people falsely chase. It's about what can I do to be of service. And that's what happens when you focus your attention the right way, but it also maximizes the benefit to others and it maximizes the benefit to you. And in many ways, you change from being self-centered. And this is the difference between hedonic happiness and eudaimonic happiness. I was chasing pleasure, avoiding pain, and it was the acquisition of things to make me look successful. And of course, that is a dead-end narrative because all the external affirmation in the world is not going to fill that empty void that we as human beings really want to fill. And many of us don't appreciate that the only thing that will fill that is to care for others, to connect for others. And ultimately, this book is about having you understand how to be your best self and be of service and give you meaning and purpose, which is eudaimonic happiness. And hedonic happiness is shallow and transitory. Eudaimonic happiness is quite deep, profound, and long-lasting. And that's really the point of this book, is how do you get there? And how do you use brain training, if you will, to have that, if you will, manifest? So that's what it's all about.
And the book does a great job, I think, of showing how you as a 12-year-old in learning brain training from someone who was not a neuroscientist sounds more like they were a practitioner of transcendental meditation or some other type of meditation, and training you on quieting your own mind. And in quieting your own mind, you started to build these lists that actually manifested in the great wealth that you did secure and the great educational outcome that you secured. Because my guess is, had you not met Ruth, you probably would not have necessarily even finished college, and perhaps never even going to medical school, because you kind of persisted in getting yourself into medical school, which is a great story in your first book that really enabled you to become the great medical surgeon that you are and the great medical entrepreneur that you've also become, because all challenges were eventually eliminated, and you took the view that you could eliminate them and hurdle them, and you did. And I think that story within a story is exceptional, and that alone probably set you on the path for writing these books. But I'm interested in knowing, did this book come out of the first book, or did you have the idea for both books and you decided to split them up into two in a series, or how did it evolve?
Well, it's funny you asked that. No, it did not. There was never any plan to do a second book. And what happened was, and it's always interesting to look at things retrospectively, as you know, if you write a book, you end up with a lot more material than you're able to put into the book. So you have to edit it. So because, not many people are going to read well, maybe some would, but the average size of a memoir is about 250 to 300 pages. And I had about 450 pages. So as a result, there were aspects in sort of that story that were not presented in depth in the book. And one of the things that people were very interested in was what was this process of manifestation or visualization. And while I went into it in some detail in the first book, there seemed to be this desire and yearning to learn more. So after a period, again, of a few years of reflection on this and getting all this feedback, it really popped into my head that, and probably because within the sort of lay public is this perspective of what manifestation is, and it's associated with a lot of woo-woo and pseudoscience. Mm-hmm. And people get lost in that, and this idea of the law of attraction or somehow the universe is listening to you actually create a lot of unhappiness because there was actually this blame aspect. Well, if you really wanted it, it would have happened. The universe would have listened to you. You didn't put enough positive vibes out there, and it's really your fault if it didn't happen. And the other problem was, of course, when The Secret came out, this was a book that was highly focused on hedonic happiness, if you will. What do you want? Oh, you want money? Okay. You want to have a high-paying job. You want to be important. And it completely missed the point. And I think that also made a lot of people unhappy, because if you do all the things in The Secret, you would end up just as I did, which is this quote unquote success from a societal perspective, but deep unhappiness in reality. And I'm sure you know innumerable number of people who have chased that, and they're externally saying, oh yeah, life's great. I have my Ferrari. I have the big house. But you know as well as I do, a lot of those people are very unfulfilled, and they keep chasing that. Mm-hmm. And the reason they keep chasing it is because the average person has been fed the same narrative. And the average person looks up to these people and says, I want to be like them. It's so great. And the reality is it isn't so great. The other problem is there are many extraordinarily driven people who, again, have the same narrative. I have to do this because if I do this, this is this affirmation of me. And everybody's going to look at me and tell me how great I am. And that happened to me too. But here I was achieving the success, but what did I leave in my wake? Loved ones, children, and a lot of misery because I was focused on me. I wasn't focused on the journey and appreciating the journey. I said I had to do this. So on the one hand, you can accomplish, but the question is at what price? And at the end of the day, is that price really worth it? And I would suggest you, and I'm sure you know from your experience, oftentimes it is not at all. So in some ways, this has been a gift. And this idea of manifestation, I decided, if you will, to set the record straight. And from the perspective of neuroscience, there's no woo-woo involved here. There's no pseudoscience. And once you extract that, fundamentally, what we're talking about is brain training and the power each of us has within ourselves to change who we are and to manifest things that will help us lead a better life and thrive as human beings, not get lost in the woo-woo stuff and be self-serving. As I said, that is a path to a dead end and is very much associated with unhappiness.
I liked about the book as well is that you're not selling anything. You're not here to say, hey, there's a device you put on your head, or there's a set of goggles that you put on your eyes, or there's something that you put in your ears and you listen to a certain type of music. You actually provide a workbook for how you can self-learn this brain training. So, the parallel I give is there are a lot of people out there that will write a book and then say, you take this personal training course and I offer it for this much money and you can get it online and it will produce this amazing outcome. You actually give the gift of the steps, which are boiled down into 6 steps. Of course, I'm a big believer in the number 7, so I was waiting for the 7th step, the punchline to it, because I just think number 7 has certain magic to it. You know, remember when you were a kid, it was 7 numbers as a phone number, and then there was kind of like an area code, but the area code was actually letters years ago. You know, I remember my folks. Do you remember that? So there was some research done on people remembering, and the limit of the memory was like 7.
Oh, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So I say to myself, you know, everyone needs to read your book, and in many ways have their kids and grandkids read, or even better, listen, because you do it in your own voice, to the book, and kind of engage in the self-learning, because obviously we've sold people on personal training. There's a huge mega personal training business, which will just teach you how to lift weights and do aerobic exercise and that sort of thing, and deal with nutrition. But this whole other half of your training your brain, which in many ways is as important, if not more important, than your physiology, of course, both together, as John F. Kennedy would say, you know, a healthy mind and a healthy body. But I think it's an underserved area. It's not an area that anyone has really built a franchise around. And in many ways, your book lays out what could eventually become a franchise for someone, but you're not selling it as a franchise. You're saying to people, learn it on your own, which is what you did with the help of Ruth, and now you're doing to reach millions, if not tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions with this new book.
Well, you know, on some level, this is what Ruth said, was to pay it forward, basically. But it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I saw already something, I think it was on Instagram, and it showed an interview I did. Mm-hmm. And it implied somehow that they were associated with me. Mm-hmm. And it said, how to do manifestation correctly, take our course. And in some ways, it was quite irritating. But again, as we both know, there's a subset of people in our population who are chasing the acquisition of money and will debase anything towards that goal. And it's very sad because, as we were just talking about, that may lead to transient happiness, but at the end of the day, it doesn't lead to true happiness or human flourishing. In fact, you know, the entrepreneurial activities I get involved in are ones that the goal isn't to look at the consumer as a profit center. It's to say, what's the minimum amount I can do this for, which will give a reasonable return on investment, is not extractive, but whose fundamental agenda is to be of service. And unfortunately, we do not see enough of that in Silicon Valley, which is a very, very sad statement, because, as you know, in the early days of Silicon Valley, people worked. It wasn't about the money at all. It was, what can I do to improve the world, the quality of life, how we interact in the world, versus now you see a whole subset of people. It has nothing to do with that. It said, can I create something which is extractive? And whether it survives, help people or not, as long as I can get the maximal amount of money out of it, that's all I'm interested in doing. And whether the company's
right. The Silicon Valley of old that you and I remember and love, and still love because there are little vestiges and pockets of it left, was more of a mentorship model. It was much more of a pay it forward. You know, there was a group of really angels that evolved into venture capitalists. And the way they looked at things was, someone mentored me. I've now made more than enough money to have time to mentor others. And those others will eventually need support. And hopefully I will teach this mentorship model going forward. And something happened in the .com period that really changed that mentorship model in the post.com period. And it's kind of evaporated. There are still a few pockets of it around. I know you give time to various startup entrepreneurs, and I do as well. And it's really pro bono time, because a lot of times this is sort of at the pure idea stage before anything is ever going to happen. And it may or may not happen years later, but you can see you're helping expand human potential. And we love to do it. And we love to see those entrepreneurs, because without them, really, there wouldn't be the world that we're living in, with so many great innovations, like being able to have a video call at 7 by 24, 365 at literally almost zero cost to it. So it's sort of a wonderful thing. So Jim, I want to congratulate you on the new book. I think it's a masterful work. I think you've actually exceeded, and I, of course, praised your first book, and I equally do, but I think you've exceeded the mission of the first book and really what Ruth taught you in ways that I really hope. So just to let you know, the foundation that I started is going to give 1,000 of these books, if not more, away to various schools, high schools, because I like, and some, maybe even grade schools, to sort of really put some action behind the praise. And hopefully we'll get all those people to give you some good Amazon reviews in paying it forward and listening to. So unlike many of the other podcasts you give, where I'm sure the podcast person just, is helping you, but isn't sort of putting the money where their mouth is and buying 1,000 books and whatever the base cost is for the books, to make it more worthwhile to get the mission out. Because ultimately, even great books, that you have to prime the pump in getting the mission out. And you've got to be able to get people to do things that actually prime that pump.
Well, I have to say that the enthusiasm for the book is way beyond what I had anticipated. I do have to say, though, that many of these podcasts, the interviewers were very enthusiastic, but having several million followers in and of itself actually moves the needle. So I certainly am appreciative of that. But no, that's wonderful. Giving 1,000 books away, I think that'll also help move the needle. But what I was going to say is when the book was first listed on Amazon, as an example, although I would suggest people use bookshop.org, which supports independent bookstores if they purchase the book. But what I was saying is it's been sort of amazing, because when Penguin Random House, who's the publisher, they put it on Amazon for pre-order. Mm-hmm. And it was, I think, listed at number 400,000, and which still in and of itself is pretty good, because they have 7 million books there. It's been out for 6 days as of today, and it's already number, I think, 134 of all books sold on Amazon.
It's pretty amazing. I mean, that is really an amazing outcome, because you're beating books that have been done by some famous authors who don't even get to that rank, right?
Yeah, no. And what's funny is I think it's number one in meditation. But what's fascinating is I think the hardback is number one. I think number 3 or 4 is the Kindle version, and number 6 is the Audible version. And you look at different of these things, like there's one for biology and there's one for self-help, but all 3 of the versions are competing against themselves.
It's a great outcome.
Yeah,
it's such a wonderful thing to see that kind of success, because what it really means is you're leaving behind a huge legacy that is unique to you and extends literature that is not really as successful, because a lot of the neuroscience literature is just not accessible to the normal reader. And I'll include that in that a good friend of mine, who I know you know, Professor Robert Sapolsky, I represented him in a copyright case against Deepak Chopra. We won't go into the details about it. You'll get a kick. We'll have some wine or beer or something at some point. I'll tell you that story. But Bob wrote this original textbook. It must have been like 1,000 pages. And it wasn't accessible. It sold whatever number of copies might have been sold into some, university libraries. And it was about neuroscience, and it was about the biological aspects, but it didn't present the way in which people can start to help themselves to become better people, which you have. Now, Bob has become very successful writing other books, including one that I'm sure you'll read and comment on, maybe you already have, called Determined, that I kind of think of as almost the opposite argument to the thesis that you present in your book. And at some point, I hope we have time to kind of have both you and Bob on the show, and I think you guys can do an interesting debate about how much of this is sort of within someone's own brain training and how much of this is kind of determined by what he calls, prior events in someone's life, which may be saying the same thing. But in many ways, the literature was very dense, and you have made it very accessible. So I definitely applaud that and hope that everyone does buy and read your book or listen to it even better because it's in your own words.
The interesting thing is that I know Bob, and I'm not sure if you do or don't know, but I actually have a podcast, and it's called intothemagicshop.com. Mm-hmm. And I actually recently interviewed Bob, as a matter of fact.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't listened to it. I have to listen to that.
Yes. So we had an animated conversation. I've been fortunate to have some very interesting folks on that podcast. So that's been quite fun to do.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.